Washington is expected to announce that it's suspending compliance with the key arms control treaty. The US and Soviet Union sealed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF Treaty, back in 1987. The agreement aimed to eliminate a whole category of nuclear missiles. Now the Americans say a new generation of Russian cruise missiles violate the pact, an accusation Moscow denies. Last week, parts of the controversial weapon system were publicly displayed near Moscow, but not the missiles themselves. Russia accuses the US of also violating the INF Treaty with other weapons systems. In an interview with DW, the US's lead arms control negotiator said that the US was suspending the treaty to force Russia's hand and allow Washington to start developing the type of weaponry banned by the pact.
We will suspend it, and then a 6-month clock runs, if you will. During that time, Russia still can get back into compliance, but it frees our obligations under the treaty. So we suspend our obligations with the intent to withdraw if they don't get back in compliance. But we have abided by the treaty for the entire time, and by suspending our obligations, that we'll be able to do the research and development of similar systems that Russia now has fully fielded in the field.
Now, that was Andrea Thompson, U.S. Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security, talking to DW's Jana Nemtsova. Let's now take a look at how the INF Treaty came to be and why it's so important.
1987, and a historic agreement between the Soviet Union and United States. When Presidents Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan signed the INF Treaty, it marked a change of course after decades of Cold War nuclear tension. The root of the tension was this: the Soviet SS-20 missile, a nuclear warhead that could strike Western Europe at short notice. That worried those European countries on the other side of the Iron Curtain, who were well within the missile's reach of 5,500 kilometres. The US response to deploy its own mid-range Pershing missiles in Europe was met with protests across the West. The protests showed the need for a new direction. The result was the INF Treaty. It banned all ground-launched ballistic missiles with ranges of between 500 and 5,500 kilometres. The Soviet Union got rid of 1,846 short and intermediate range missiles, and the United States 846, before the implementation deadline in 1991. A total of 2,692 missiles were destroyed.
Joining me now is a Russia analyst, Konstantin Eggert from Moscow. Welcome, Konstantin. Will Moscow be quite happy with this US move, free to do as they please, or will Russia be worried about threats of a new Cold War?
Well, I think it cuts both ways, and so it is clear that in some respects Russia will be happy. It will be able to keep the SSC-8 missiles that it has already produced, as we've heard the Assistant Secretary of State saying. It will also be able to deploy it wherever it wants. And I think it was one of the sweeteners that John Bolton, the National Security Advisor to President Trump, brought to Moscow last autumn when he said, OK, yes, we're leaving the treaty. We're sick and tired of you, but you can deploy them, for example, against China, which is one of the sort of, it's a big white elephant in the room here, because this is what America is also interested in deploying these missiles against the Chinese. On the other hand, of course, if President Putin wants to start a new arms race with the United States, we know what the result is going to be. It's going to be exactly the one that happened in the 1980s, namely Russia will lose.
But the US hasn't completely closed the door as yet. We just heard the US Arms Control Chief saying that Moscow has 6 months to comply with alleged breaches. Do you think Vladimir Putin will be listening?
I don't think so. I don't imagine him waking up one day and saying, well, God, I mean, how could I miss this chance? No way. Putin is very much focused on expanding Russian military arsenal, giving the military new materiel, new hardware, and I don't think he can roll back even just because that will mean that he will have to admit that he was lying for a long time. So I can't imagine this happening barring some fantastic sort of development, some miracle, really.
Constantine, you mentioned China, the elephant in the room. Now, there are those who say Washington's move is aimed at China, which is not bound by this treaty and apparently building medium-range missiles. Is that view shared in Russia?
I think that many people in Russia, although not admitting that, will share that view. You know, about China in Moscow, they speak as they speak about a dead man, either good or nothing. But I think there's a growing fear of Chinese expansionism, of Chinese growing military might, of Chinese very sort of strong arm politics on the global scene. So, as I said, I think that to some extent, quite a few people in Russia will be happy with that. Another issue is whether America and Russia will be able to find common ground on the Chinese threat. If this really happens, then, of course, this treaty will be much less relevant, let's put it like that. To some extent, it is definitely a relic of the Cold War, but you have to agree what the new parameters are, and this maybe will be what will be discussed between Moscow and Washington in the coming years. Maybe, again, I'm not sure about that.
Konstantin Eggert in Moscow, thank you very much for your analysis.
Thank you.
If the treaty now collapses, a nuclear arms race threatens Europe as it did back in the 1980s. At that point, hundreds of thousands of Germans protested against the deployment of American nuclear weapons on German soil. DW's Fabian von der Mark travelled to the southern town of Heilbronn, where American medium-range missiles were based in the 80s.
Here, in this clearing in southern Germany, American nuclear missiles were stationed during the 1980s. The only building left of what used to be the U.S. Army Waldheide base is Barrack number 901. American soldier Larry Nichols was stationed here in the 80s when one of the worst situations imaginable actually occurred. On January 11, 1985, a Pershing II missile exploded.
One thought it was a nuclear explosion. It was a shocker. I mean, we're talking about a nuclear weapon carrier, a rocket motor. And for something like that to happen here at the height of the Cold War, the whole world was alarmed.
3 U.S. soldiers died. 16 were seriously wounded. Nichols created the memorial in their honor. He never got over his fear of nuclear weapons.
You didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but you knew what you had and what you were capable of doing. And that was frightening, yes.
It was only after this accident that the people of Heilbronn were informed that nuclear missiles were stationed directly in their vicinity. It took another 3 years for the missiles to be removed. After the INF Treaty was agreed on, Waldheide was the first base in Germany to remove and destroy its nuclear missiles. Isabel Steidl knows this story from her parents and from her high school classes. She is a member of the local Green Party and actively involved in protests against nuclear armament.
Personally, I'm terrified by this. I think that there's nothing more important than keeping world peace. In particular, that no new nuclear weapons are employed. Also, that as few countries as possible have nuclear weapons so that accidents are less likely to happen.
She meets Larry Nichols, the former soldier. Both worry that history could repeat itself.
Trump has said that he wants to back out of the nuclear missile treaty. What's your opinion on this?
New U.S. missiles. Nichols isn't sure how he feels about that.
America
is in a very, very difficult situation at the moment, and my opinion is that it's everyone's fault.
In the 1980s, there were massive demonstrations against U.S. missiles across Germany, including here in Heilbronn. Isabel Steidl would attend a protest march if there were one today.
I would definitely go out and demonstrate. It's very important to me that peace remains our top priority. I would definitely go out and join a protest for this cause.
Back at the former Waldheide base, the old U.S. soldier and the young pacifist share the same fear, that the arms race between Russia and the U.S. will start up again, and no one will have learned from the mistakes of the past.